Welcome to this week's Into the Wilderness podcast. I am one of your hosts, Daryl Pace, and the other guy is
I'm just the other guy.
The other guy. That's what happens.
It's a good movie, that.
Yeah, it's quite funny with Will Ferrell and
the other guy is Byron Pace. That's me.
Yeah, the other guy. We have a long show today. It's not long as in it's long and boring. It's a brilliant show. It's just over 2 hours long, as you can probably see in your thing, and we are talking all about Atlantic salmon. We do actually touch on a few other things in aquaculture.
Atlantic salmon is the backbone of it, isn't it? It is. It was. It's a podcast we've been meaning to do for a little while, and I do want to do a few more on aquaculture. And I was going to say fishing, and I mentioned this a week ago when we put out the other podcast. This one isn't even really about fishing, although fishermen will find
we do talk about fishing
a little bit, but it's not really. It's not a fishing podcast.
No.
But it is about salmon and everything that's connected with them and the issues that they have been suffering from and still are suffering from.
This would be particularly good for students.
It will. In fact, I think Beth was saying that it's going to be one for her sister because she's busy trying to get the final pieces together for her dissertation. It's all going to be on Atlantic salmon. So
if you are a student and you're listening to this, give us a message.
Yeah, definitely do. I know that we did a fishing-based podcast probably about 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
Along similar sort of veins, talking about the Fisheries Trust and the work that gets done in our river systems here. And one of our friends, he used it as part of one of his papers that he wrote at university.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
that's amazing what we can provide for people.
So, I think
if you are a student, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You're not getting any discount on our store because I believe that students have more money than most other people. From what I have seen, I never went to university, but all of my friends did, and I spent a lot of time drinking with them socially. And they had more money to spend than I ever did.
And that's because they also have now very large student debts that they're paying
off.
No,
but I know that. But my point being is that they shouldn't get a discount because they've got more money to burn.
But you're all getting discounts because now that we've slid onto that topic, there's a big discount going on in our shop right now. Yeah. A lot of the old designs, as we're making way for new designs, are heavily discounted. So do go and check that out. But back to the show. Even if you're someone who never cast a line in the river, and you're only into shooting, or you only like hill walking, or all the many other things that are vast array of people who listen, you will still find this interesting.
Because most of you will drive past a river at some point in your week,
and you will never look at it the same again after this.
Think about what's going on underneath that river.
Surface. Yeah. Very important, fascinating subjects, and pretty worrying with regard to some of the things that we talk about. But there are people and organisations behind the scenes that a lot of you probably won't even realise working very hard to try and find the answers so that we can hold on to what is. Just with regard to Atlantic salmon, an iconic species, especially for Scotland and the UK.
You know, I actually saw yesterday online, on the line, there was a picture, I think it was on the BBC, it definitely won the Wildlife Photography of the Year last year, and it was the picture of the seahorse holding the cotton bud underwater.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about, yeah.
And it was, obviously ocean and plastics. I actually saw one yesterday that someone posted, and it was a caddisfly larva that had made its shell partly out of plastic parts. Really? It's the same difference, just in our rivers. Yeah, it was using little bits of plastic to build its little shell.
It's just we talk in this podcast about chemicals in our systems and how that affects the fish as they're going back out to sea and trying to make that transition between freshwater and saltwater. And it wasn't something that I had really thought of in great detail, and it's something you can't see unless you're testing for it, but can have massive consequences. And we've talked about plastic on this show before, and microfibers and microbeads, which have now been banned, I think, in most countries. I actually saw a video, I think it was last week, and I wish I could remember what country it was in, but it was essentially, it was a third world country, and they were disposing of their rubbish. And their
I've
way of
seen
disposing of the rubbish was a lorry, a tipper truck, backing up to a river and just tipping it off into the river, which obviously runs off and into the seas. And that's everyone's problem.
And that's the thing that it's always a hard one when you think about, I know we're talking about environment and plastics now, but it is related because it goes into the water courses and stuff. It's always a hard one when you see a government back home, like the UK or in Europe. I know they're doing it in America as well, pushing for renewable reducing plastics, taxation on different products, bottle banks, so you get repayment, so the bottle costs more, but you get repayment when you go to the shop and put the thing in.
Incentivized, yeah.
And then when you do the traveling that we kind of do, and you go around the world, I've been out to the Middle East, and if you go to Africa and places like that, and you actually look at what's going on, India, Byron's been to India, you look at the rubbish, see what's being thrown into the rivers, and you actually think, what is the point? In a way, because what you're achieving is so small compared to what they're dumping back in.
It's sad to think like that, but it's hard not to.
Yeah.
It's hard not to.
It's like
because it makes it almost insignificant.
That's what I'm saying, and I know that you shouldn't think like that because every little does help. But when you've got a world population increasing and the population increase is in these parts of the world, India, Asia,
all of those developing countries,
and you think that waste is only increasing because they don't actually have the infrastructure to get rid of it. Only in the fact the National Geographic that's got in front of me this month has pictures from developing countries with rubbish piles bigger, the size of 3-4 story buildings in this country, because they've got nowhere to put this rubbish. Nowhere.
There was a report out in the last 2 weeks, I think, and I haven't actually read anything about it other than what I heard on Radio 4 a couple of days ago, and they have predicted that we essentially have 12 years now to make the changes that we need, to put the changes in place to prevent irreversible damage to the planet.
I think there's so many issues, and I think especially with when it comes to the push for renewable energies and electric power, it's so hard to go, well, let's just go electric tomorrow and everything's going to be fine, everything's going to run off renewables, because we don't actually have the power yet to run. If everyone had an electric car tomorrow,
we couldn't do it.
We couldn't all plug our cars in. And I actually saw another thing online, and it was the crazy thing. It was the Tesla. It was a Tesla outlet in the United States, and they had the Tesla charging point actually at the garage. And the guy basically videoed and followed the leads from the Tesla thing to the back of the Tesla garage, and they were running big generators, diesel generators at the back to power the electric sockets. And it's things like that where you're like, this is insane. This is absolutely insane that you're using a fossil fuel to then power your Tesla car.
That sort of direct connection is utter madness. And I was having this conversation just yesterday. I was fortunate to be stalking almost right in the centre of the Cairngorms yesterday. And the one gent that I was with, he had driven up in his Mitsubishi Outlander hybrid car.
Is it like one of those 50-50 hybrid things?
No, it's not 50-50, but yeah, it's got battery and it also has a petrol engine. I was genuinely intrigued, and I was asking him about how good it is and how he drives it, how it's changed his driving habits. And he said, well, essentially he gets, not in the middle of winter, if it's really cold, this reduces, but on average, he gets about 30 miles off the battery charge. Mm-hmm. So 30 miles, which I was thinking about it for myself, that would actually get me to work and back most days.
Yes.
Almost to work and back every day to our offices here. And then then it kicks over onto the petrol. But then I was saying to him that it's completely pointless if the energy if you plug it in at your house, like where's that power come from?
Yeah. So
unless you know that power is coming from renewable energies, then you're back to exactly where you started again.
Without going down the line of is renewable energies actually viable because of government subsidies and so on. Scotland as a whole is actually pretty far forward in the renewable energies.
Yeah, we're pretty green.
We have actually proven multiple times now. I think it was only 6 months ago that the country managed to run off of pure renewable energies for 4 or 5 days without using any fossil fuels. So the point is, it is there, but you need to look further into the impact that renewable energy has on the environment, because they're not impact free.
Oh no, that's the big. That's the big lie.
You can't win. That's the problem. We could do an
free.
entire podcast on renewable energies,
and we should actually.
Yeah.
I need to know a little bit more about it myself, but it'd be good to have another podcast with 4 people on it, like the podcast you're about to listen to today.
So if you know anyone, an expert or someone in leading the field in renewable energies, and they know a thing or two, get in contact with us, because we would like to speak to them about it. Lots of interesting things going on in the world.
I would. And just as a we haven't. I was going to say as a final thought, but we haven't talked about the new competition for this podcast.
Oh, you haven't. Yeah.
So we'll get to that next. But I was just up the Glen first thing this morning doing an interview with somebody about peatland restoration, and I think that's a topic that we should cover, because I thought it was, to be perfectly honest, I thought it was going to be pretty dull. When I went, we were flying some drones up on this restoration project last week for a short documentary.
I've seen it done before. I've filmed a little bit, and
you have, yeah,
up in the Highlands.
And I thought I was going to go and do this interview today, and it would be pretty short, 5 minutes, and I'd get it done because it was a job that needed to get done. But I ended up speaking to the lady for probably about 20 minutes after, and it's really quite fascinating. If you can hear anything sorry, I got distracted
in the background of the podcast, that is rain on the windows. It is coming down
so hard.
I'm kind of glad I didn't go out on the hill today.
It got me out off my stride there of what I was saying. But what I was saying was that the peatland restoration and what's going on across the whole country, not just Scotland. There's a huge amount of it that has gone on in the past and is carrying on right now, particularly in the Yorkshire Dales. Is really interesting. So I think I'm going to try and get somebody on to talk about it, to explain what it is that they're doing. But it's a big operation. There's quite a lot of government money that's going into it. And just as an enticing point, because I thought this was fascinating right now, there are a number of areas that they've been restoring for peatland restoration, and they can trace back the issues to why there's big open peat areas, to back in World War II and planes crashing and starting big wildfires there.
And it's burnt the peat.
And it really hot burns that eroded the surface, dried out the peat, and now you've got these big open peat areas.
They often found bombs up on these areas as well, because planes that were returning, Germans or something, that they just needed to get rid of their payload because they were being shot at probably, or they were running out of fuel. They would just dump them everywhere. So I mean, if they didn't go off, they're stuck there as well. So yeah, I can believe that.
It was fascinating that was the reason that there was some of this issue with the peatland habitat, was because of plane crashes and wildfires a lot during World War II, and also because during World War II they didn't have the manpower in the moorlands to maintain the habitat.
Yeah.
So whereas we have all this rotational burning now, reducing the fuel load on the hills, there was no one there. They were all fighting the war. So all the heather was getting away, and when a wildfire got going, it just went. And that's actually what has damaged a lot of these areas that they're trying to fix now.
Never knew that. There you go.
Oh, there you go.
Learn something new every day.
Nothing to do with the podcast today, but I found it fascinating because I learned that just this morning.
Thank you for all of the nice messages about the previous podcast. That was just me and Byron talking about Norway. I've had quite a number of people saying they really enjoyed it. Even one person saying it was the best podcast we've done yet.
That must have been a lie.
Yeah, really. So I really appreciate that. And like I said, I would have gone into more detail, but there's more things coming out from it. So you'll just have to wait for that.
Competition for this week's podcast. We are going to give you the chance to win a Reloading with Rosie Hornady mug. Now, we've already given away one. That was a couple of shows ago. But we've got a couple more, so we're going to give away another one. We had a lot of people enter last time. So if you entered desperately wanting the Reloading with Rosie mug and you weren't the winner, now's your opportunity to enter again. And I didn't think at all how you were going to enter this, but
just
should we keep it a picture competition?
Just put the picture and then just say, "I want this mug underneath."
Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah,
that'll do. We'll stick it up. It'll be up on Facebook. Check out our Instagram story because we always stick it up on there. And as we always say, if you don't use the social media platforms, and I don't blame you if you don't use them, then please just feel free. Email in the show and we'll enter you in the draw.
Yes, nice and simple. I think we've talked for long enough now.
Especially on a long podcast.
Yeah, on a long podcast. Enjoy the show. and we will speak to you in 2 weeks' time.
Gents, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. We are sitting in our office on a very rainy, very dull, very typical Scottish autumn day, I think. By way of I know already, because from the conversation that we've just had before we hit record, that it's going to be a fascinating podcast. But just by way of introduction for the people listening, Mark, do you want to just kick off and just explain who you are, what you do, briefly, kind of what your background is?
Yeah, I'm Mark Bilsby. I'm the CEO for the Atlantic Salmon Trust. The Atlantic Salmon Trust is a UK-based charity that's there to ensure that we have salmon and sea trout in the future. So we're a research-based organisation that brings people together, find out facts about salmon and sea trout so that we can improve their management.
And Will?
I'm a ghillie on the River Dee, first and foremost, I suppose. And also I'm one half of Twin Peaks Fly Fishing, which is a very, very small fly fishing business where we try to do as much as we can. I don't know about that. We do as much as we can to promote the sport and try and offer ourselves really as that first stepping stone for people to get into the sport of any type of fly fishing, but I suppose predominantly salmon fishing, which is, if you don't have the means to get into the sport, it can be a difficult sport to get into that first time. So pretty much anything fly fishing, we're just here to promote and support and get as many people doing it as we possibly can.
Because you don't like fly fishing at all, do you, yourself?
No, can't stand it.
You have to force yourself to do it.
Absolutely.
It's a terrible job to have.
Yeah. Imagine doing that as a full-time job.
Some people wish they could.
Mm.
So I'm just trying to work out where to kick off here. We're going to be talking predominantly about salmon. I mean, most people, well, certainly people in the countryside, maybe who live near a river, will be aware that there are issues with populations of salmon over time. I wouldn't be surprised if our big sort of urban centres probably couldn't even ID a salmon if it was shown to them, which is probably the sad truth of it. Mark, can you give us or paint us a picture of the state of Atlantic salmon in this country? And maybe touch a little bit on the historical kind of how it was and what we've seen trending-wise today, because ultimately that is why we're concerned about Atlantic salmon.
Yeah, well, just the name Atlantic salmon. It's a fish. To understand the fish and what the factors that are impacting, you need to understand a little bit of their life cycle. So you've got a fish that spawns in fresh water, and the juveniles will then spend 1, 2, 3, maybe more years in fresh water before heading out to sea. And they swim right across the Atlantic. So the fish that leave Scotland, if they're going to spend one sea winter, come back as grills, they're probably going up as far as the Norwegian Sea and feeding off there. If they're going to be multi-sea winter fish, they're going all the way across the Atlantic to the west coast of Greenland.
It's crazy,
so
isn't it?
You need to think of these as Atlantic salmon, truly Atlantic salmon, because they cover the whole of that ocean. And if you look at the context of salmon in the 1970s, there are about 8 to 10 million salmon swimming around in the Atlantic for all of the countries where salmon originate from, all the way around.
So just to explain that to people, we always think of Scotland, UK, the Atlantic salmon that run here, but there's a European. You're talking about the European component.
I'm talking about American, Canadian,
everything.
Icelandic, Norwegian, the whole shoot and caboodle of salmon that swim out into the Atlantic. There are about 8 to 10 million of them in the 70s. We're now down to about 3 million.
How do we know there were 8 to 10 million?
There are two organisations that have a duty to look after salmon at sea on an international basis. The first is the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, which is a bit of a mouthful, so it's just called NASCO. NASCO is an international treaty that is there to bring governments together to look at things like fishing quotas. Quite often hear in the news about what's been happening at Greenland and fishing quotas in Greenland. And they're the people that bring the governments together and get them to sign international agreements there. They have a scientific organisation linked to them to provide them with the facts, and that's the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, ICES. And ICES' job is to count fish and provide advice on fish stocks. And they've been counting fish systematically for years, and they've been able to go back, see what was there in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and where we are now. And they've seen this downward trend.
Just remind us of those numbers again, from what to what?
8 to 10 million,
Yeah.
between 8 and 10 million, down to about 3 million. So
That's
that's
not
the
a lot.
context.
3 million across globally.
The whole Atlantic.
The whole
Is
of
it
the
pretty? I'm a little shocked, to be honest.
The numbers of 10 I actually thought were relatively
Yeah.
not that big, I actually think, in the grand scheme of the world.
Yeah.
And when now you're down to 3 potentially,
It's crazy, because when I think, our little river here, so the Westwater here runs into the Northwest as part of the Northwest system. I don't know for the last couple of years, but certainly a few years ago there was about 2,000 fish running up there. So about 8 to 12,000 run up the Northwest. That's pretty significant when you look at 3 million.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm wow.
So, and we think earlier on there would have been more, but just with modern sort of estimates, that's the best
figures
that we can get.
Okay.
So we're more accurate now because of the technology that's improved.
No, even when they always try and compare apples with apples, so that when you go back in time,
so it can always be comparable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I suppose the big question that everyone is asking, and this probably gets to the big question for your project, the Missing Salmon project, which is going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about, is where have they gone? This could take 3-4 hours.
Yeah, no. You need to make yourself comfortable.
But, from a basic point of view, just give people an idea of what we kind of know, and then we're going to dig into a lot about what we don't know. But what do we know about the population decline?
What I think's been shown when you look at various rivers, such as the Dee, as a nearby one, they've always produced roughly the same amount of smolts. It's come down a really small amount. But
same amount of fish going back out to sea.
Yep.
So that tells you, just to elaborate on that tells you that the actual river system itself, in terms of what it can sustain,
is quite healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it
keeps a relatively constant number.
So it's a production line. Mm-hmm. And so we get these fish coming out, or produced. And what we've seen is that marine survival has dropped. So the number of fish going to sea has dropped. So if you had it's dropped from about 25%, some estimates as high as 40% of the smolts that went to sea in the 1960s would come back as adult salmon.
Very high. Yeah.
So if you put 1 million fish out to sea, that means you're going to get 400,000 back, which is brilliant. What we've seen now is that marine survival's dropped to about 3%. So if you put that same 1 million fish out, you're only getting 30,000 back, and that's when you need. That's the rub of it. You've just got such few fish coming back these days.
That's a tight number to work with. 30,000 to basically keep restocking a population. When you think how much they have to go through when they're at sea, all the things, not just fishing, natural things that happen to them.
Yeah, and in the whole Atlantic.
I know.
You've got the river system, the estuary, and then the entire Atlantic, where you've got to try and find where this is happening.
Because to some extent we can control what's happening on our inland rivers. I know I sit on the Esk Rivers and Fisheries Trust here, and we're always trying to open up bits of river that have been blocked historically. There's some sort of barrier there, so you open it up, the fish can go up, they can spawn. It's more ground, more riverbed for young fish to live in, and then ultimately turn into smolts and go out to sea. But there's a limit. Eventually, there's a carrying capacity. You can have the perfect or close to perfect system. You have a maximum carrying capacity. In terms of what we can do and kind of control, we can't do any more than that. I mean, there must be plenty of rivers in Scotland which are in that kind of state.
Well, I think we need to really understand there's much more of an interaction between freshwater environment and the marine environment, and we found some people have found that bigger smolts survive better. So whether that's being able to outswim a predator or have better body reserves to get them over a lean time, we don't know the answer yet. But we have seen that there's the quality of the smolt from fresh water can impact what's happening at sea. And it can be something as simple as exposure to a pesticide residue.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the pesticides that are knocking around at incredibly low levels and have been banned, but they're still being detected. And we're seeing that when you do experiments to see how well smolts adapt from a freshwater environment to a saltwater environment, they're not doing as well if they've been exposed to this pesticide.
Is that because of that crossover between salts, how their body system changes?
Yeah, well, they go from being a freshwater fish to a saltwater fish, so they've got to deal with the salt. They've got to deal with being able to, the whole kidney function changes. The same way that we can't drink salt water, they can't when they're a freshwater fish, but they need to be able to when they go to sea.
And so their body goes through an actual physical change.
Yeah, it is a huge physiological change they're going through. And if you've had a pesticide come in and disrupt the fish, then the fish, we're seeing much greater mortality rates associated with fish that have got these. But there's all of these factors, and what we're trying to do with the Missing Salmon Project is bring all of that knowledge together and put it in one place, create this framework of the likely suspects, so we can then triage them in the same way you would in a hospital. You deal with the things that are causing the greatest damage first, but you need to understand it before you try and fix it. And it's understanding what is killing that fish right across the board. Because if you there's 5 of us here. If you ask us all, what are the top 5 problems for salmon in the world, we will probably give different answers.
But there'll be a few crossovers.
Crossovers. And what we need to do is there's no shortage of opinions in fisheries management in Scotland,
some
the UK,
more valid than others.
all over the world. It's, you put 5 of us, you will get at least 10 opinions. And so what we're trying to do, so the likely suspects framework, is bring all of that together so that we can understand what is killing the fish. Because if you've got that, if you know what is truly killing the fish and where they're going missing, then you're halfway there to being able to fix it.
You can't fix what you don't know.
It's difficult, isn't it? It's so vast, and when we look at, we've kind of established that a lot of the issue lies at the point where the fish are going back out to sea. The issues that are out there and the vastness of the potential problem, is it overly ambitious to be trying to look at everything? You can look at everything if you've got unlimited time and unlimited funds. I don't imagine you have either of those. Is it overly ambitious to be trying to look at everything and potentially not coming to a conclusion, rather than trying to find an absolute definitive answer on a smaller number of topics or issues that you think could be the problem?
I think the key is to work on the best information that you've got and not be paralysed by fear of the unknown. You need to recognise it, but you need to be able to bring together what you know, because that allows you to deal with the problems that you're aware of, and it also steers you on finding out the bits that you don't know. I'm trying to avoid sounding like Donald Rumsfeld here. But you're trying to steer research programs. So if we want to know what the impacts of pesticides are in the real world, or what the bycatch of pelagic trawlers is in the real world, then we need to steer that research. But we need to be able to say, well, from the information we've got, bycatch is an issue, or it's not an issue. And then if it is an issue, we need to find out why it's an issue. And if you can do that, you're halfway there to being able to deal with the problem, because you can look at how you can manage.
You put things in place to try and mitigate against.
But you do it on the best information you've got. So when we do our first iteration of this likely suspects framework, it'd be a big step in the right direction. But then when we look back in 10 years' time and we're on our 3rd or 4th iteration of this likely suspects framework, we're going to look at it and go,
wrong.
That was so wrong. It was crude. How could we think this at the time? But you have to take that big first step, and you have to have the confidence to go and do that. And you need to bring together some really good minds to work on this, to bring together that information.
So right now you're at the point of drawing up a list of all the potential problems that are causing the issue of non-returning salmon, and then you're going to go through them with the best people of those subjects and try and work out what direction it takes you.
So we're trying to split the salmon's life cycle into a series of what we're calling domains. So you can look at the headwaters of a river, the main stem, the estuary, coastal environment, and then offshore. And we're trying to work out what's dying in the salmon's life cycle, which salmon are dying in each of these domains. And then for each domain, what is killing the fish in that domain. So we're breaking it down into bite-sized chunks that we can get our heads around.
Yeah.
And we are lucky enough to have international support for this. We're a small organisation, but NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, have called for ICES to be able to bring together their experts to help us form this suspects framework for the marine environment. We need to do the same in the freshwater environment. And that's bringing together the local fisheries managers. So to get the fishery boards, trusts, Marine Scotland, the UK government, and the NGOs, bring them together, sit them down in a room, and go, here's the evidence that we've got for each of these areas, and let's see if we can triage it. In the same way, if you went into a hospital and you weren't breathing, you would be seen first over somebody who had a sprained ankle.
Yeah, and each domain, I suppose, will have we'll be able to manage differently. If the domain in the deep saltwater of the Atlantic, there's less you're going to be able to do about that from a management's perspective as the headwaters of the river, or even the estuary section. In that section there might actually be something physically we can do, but we need to find out where these problems are happening.
I mean, some of it in terms of the rivers is on a smaller scale that it is being done already. Why do we have less power in this particular river when they electrofish it? Okay, there's a barrier here. They need to open up another bit of river. So that it is being done, but you're talking on a vast scale from top to bottom, straight back out to sea and all the way back to the river.
Yeah, and it's also focusing those resources. So it's making sure that our aim is to be able to provide fishery managers. People have to take the day-to-day decisions on where to spend money, on how to get the best return to their fishery, to help them, provide them with the tools to do their job, so they can say, well, the best investment we can get is to remove all the obstacles. And then we can it then empowers them to go to the likes of Scottish Government and say, we need some financial support here. If you want salmon, if Scotland wants salmon, and we need some financial support to help us do this, to remove these obstacles, because it's the most effective tool that we've got to manage fish.
Will, you being a ghillie on the river, you're speaking to fishermen all the time. It'll be on, and has been for years, on people's minds the fact that they're not catching as many fish, especially the older guys, I would imagine.
Yeah.
They're not catching as many fish as they were 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
This year may be a slight exception because we had no water to catch any fish. But what is the general feeling? What's the opinion that people come up with? Because everyone's an expert, especially fishermen. We're the worst.
Of course,
as to why there's no salmon anymore. What's the arguments that people coming up with? I'm not necessarily asking you to justify them, but what do you hear? Because you see a lot of people.
You see a number of things, and every person has their own idea on what the problem is. Fishermen. And myself included, after a tough week's fishing, it's very easy to point the finger at any flying bird that's flying up and down that you think might be eating them, or predators in the saltwater environment and things like that. You can be very quick to point the finger, and I'm not 100% sure if that's necessarily the answer. I think a lot of the guys would honestly say, if you put them on the spot and said, what is the one thing, I think most people would say they don't know. I'd say the vast majority would be, global warming, overfishing at sea, maybe what the salmon are eating, freshwater predation, saltwater predation, salmon farming on the west coast, all the things that we've all heard before are kind of the things that you just keep hearing over and over again. But I've never met anybody that can sort of say this one thing is it. And it's a difficult one, because the worrying thing is, we know more about the landscape of the moon than we do underneath our own oceans. And so trying to find out what's happening to these 4 to 8 inch long fish as they enter the Atlantic Ocean, and we're hoping for them to come back, trying to find out exactly where this problem is.
It's big, dark and scary down there.
Absolutely. And I think, worryingly, we just kind of, we point fingers at what we can physically see. And I think the really interesting thing about this project, whether you're going to find an answer in the deep darks of the Atlantic, I'm not quite so sure about, but being able to tick off each of these areas and be able to... So
you can leave it behind and say, okay, that's not the problem.
Yeah, and not so much on a specific river by river basis. So we've talked about removing barriers, but that's very much on a
specific
very
system.
local area, isn't it? And this is looking... Mark will tell me how many river systems the Missing Salmon project is covering, but it's not just one river, it's a whole area going into one huge area of the Moray Firth, which I think is quite a large percentage of salmon run into.
We've got a tracking program to look at 7 rivers, what we can learn as smolts go down to sea, out of the headwaters, down the main stem, out to sea, and for the first 100 kilometres of their ocean journey.
This hasn't started yet, though, has it?
No, we're just gearing up for it for the next, when the smolts go to sea, which will be next spring. But with the framework, the likely suspects framework, we're taking right across the Atlantic. So if our Icelandic friends have got good information, our friends in Canada, America have got good information, we're bringing that all together. We don't want to just say, well, it wasn't invented in the northeast of Scotland, therefore we're ignoring it.
Yeah.
It's right across the Atlantic. Bring that all together so that we can have the best understanding of we can, so that we can prioritise. And as you say, if some issues that we can't deal with, then we need to recognise them, but we need to be able to compensate for them elsewhere if we want salmon. So we can put more effort into either looking after the freshwater
things that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, over the years I've thought about it a lot. I think as all people who have a passion for migratory fish, not just salmon, sea trout as well, but it's a very different conversation that. And I understand mainly from being on the trust of the carrying densities of the river, and I know that our rivers, particularly around here, they have very, very good carrying densities, and they're putting a lot of smolts out to sea. So in terms of what's happening in our river systems, it's not 100% under control, but as much as you can manage, it looks pretty good. And we do have fairly good returns by comparison to other rivers in Scotland here. But there's still a massive amount of fish that are not coming back, which historically were. If you look back, I've looked at stats on the Northwest back to the 1940s, and it's crazy when you see the numbers that used to come in there. And the only thing that has sort of carried weight in the arguments that I have in my head has been predation out at sea. The big unknown of, is there someone who shouldn't be scooping up salmon at sea, scooping up salmon? And then the issue of warming seas and where their food is moving to. Is it moving out with the range that they would normally migrate to go and eat? And I know that's been speculated on in years gone by, particularly with thin fish coming back. I mean, I don't know who wants to pick this up, but what do we know about that particular aspect, about the actual place that they go that our fish go to feed, and what's happened in that area?
As technology moves on, we're getting more and more information about the habits of fish at sea, and they can do it. There's a huge number of ways in which they can follow fish and follow the fish's food, and we're really starting to get a better understanding of where the fish go. 30 years ago, small silver tags were put on the fish, and if they were found in a trawl or something, then they would be reported as, we've caught this tag fish here, there and everywhere. Nowadays you're putting on satellite tags so you can follow the fish back. People in North America have followed fish back from their feeding grounds of Greenland as they've started that migration back. Putting data loggers on the fish, so you can work out the temperature and depth that they've been swimming at. Actually, when you understand navigation, you can work out where that fish has been feeding in the sea. So if you know that they're at a certain temperature and depth, we know where noon is, we can get longitude and latitude from the fish.
You must have to track. Given what we've just said about the amount of fish that are lost at sea, you're going to have to track a lot of fish to end up with something that's going to be a full cycle of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's bringing together the different technologies, and it's like, well, this bit of kit will give you that piece of the jigsaw puzzle. This bit of kit will do another one, and you need more of those to get the full picture. So it is difficult, and working in the marine environment is expensive.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring it back to, this is why we need to bring together everything that we know into a framework, so that when if we're going to commission work at sea, that it's for a reason. It passes the so what test. So we're doing it for that reason.
It's not for the sake of more research.
Not for academic reasons. All of this research has to be done to have better management. Because if we want to study the decline of salmon till there are not any more salmon, that's one thing. If you want to understand salmon, so you can reverse that decline, that's very different proposition, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think it's what a lot of the fishery managers around the UK are trying to do. And our job is to try and help inform them and provide them with the tools to do that.
So the tracking program that you're going to be undertaking, I know you've got some bits of kit on the floor here. Just explain how you're going to undertake that, and over what period of time you're expecting to get data back. What's the thing? You assured me it wasn't a bomb.
No.
It looks like a large water bottle.
Yeah.
Those watching in black and white, it looks like a 2-litre bottle. It's quite heavy. It's had the batteries removed, and this is a listening device. And what it's going to do, it's an acoustic receiver, and we put these on the seabed or in rivers, and then we tag our fish with a tag that's about the size of a paracetamol tablet.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Pop that in there, and it's an acoustic tag, and it makes a coded ping, and it goes, "I'm number 37. I'm number 37."
Oh wow! So it's a sound signature you can read.
Yeah. So that goes down.
As the Russian submarines are tracking sound, it's something else.
So we're going to tag fish on 7 rivers around the Murray Firth. So from the Devon up to the Oikle and the Shin, the main river.
I am rather fond of the Devon.
Yeah. So, and we're going to follow the fish from their headwaters as they go down the main stem, and then out to sea. And we're going to have a series of these listening devices in arrays. An array, I suppose the scientific term, is just like a curtain of these, a wall of these listening devices. So the fish go past, and if they go within 700 metres on reasonable weather, they'll be detected. So that tag, which is about the size of a paracetamol tablet, will be detected about up to 700 metres
crazy,
away
isn't it?
by this, and it'll go, number 37's just gone past, and we'll be able to pick up. These are 700 metres apart. They've got about a 400 metre range.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So we put them every 700 metres.
And how far out? So you're down the river and obviously at the mouth of the river.
Yep.
But then how far out to sea are you placing those?
So the furthest we can monitor fish is about 100 kilometres from the mouth of the river.
How deep can these go?
These can go as long as your piece of rope, really.
Okay.
They're really robust.
They're not left on the seabed. They're hung.
No. We put about 80 kilos of weight on the bottom of this.
Oh boy.
And then in deep water, there's they listen. This is what they're really good at. And you can also say, listen for this release signal. And when you ask it to release, there's an automatic release. It'll pop a buoy up to the surface, and you can then pick it up. Because you need to recover it.
I was going to say, because leaving something on the seabed, I spent many years underwater, and stuff moves. It's amazing. Tidal flow, just fishing boats going over, whatever it may be. You can leave. I've done it before. You've left an anchor there one day. Someone's dropped an anchor. You go, and it's 100 meters away from where they said, or 200 meters. So it can be a real pain on the seabed because things just move.
Oh, absolutely. And there's lots of people. The big news to me in the Murray Firth, it shouldn't be news, but is how often the seabed is trawled.
Oh, yeah.
and dredge.
Dredge.
So what are you going to do about that? Because people pick those up. Right?
So we're avoiding the areas where there's lots and lots of dredging.
Because the dredges depends how they operate, could destroy. Could easily
absolutely.
destroy
A dredge is the equivalent of a snowplow hitting this, and it will go ping. And worse than that, it'll probably damage the trawl. So
and you can't get the data back until you retrieve it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's why it's vitally important.
So,
are you going to put out, once you start the project, are you going to make it very publicly aware what these are? Because it is possible someone might find one somehow.
Yeah, there's a note on them saying it's not a bomb.
Oh, there is. Okay.
And call this number. And it's part of the ocean tracking network. So you phone up the number and...
Because I tell you what, if there's not a label, the bomb squad will blow that.
Daryl would have been out there in his old job.
You don't know what it is, you blow it.
Yeah. It does say...
very much like the thing we blew up on Sky.
Yeah.
An acoustic monitoring receiver. Although this one's been underwater. This is one that we've taken back. And this was in deep water. And it was only in for a few weeks, but you can see how much barnacle growth's been on
already.
it, and that's been cleaned up. So we put these out. We have to. These will be put into the sea in March next year, and March 2019. We'll put them out. We've got a series of arrays, so we can look at where we think the fish are going to be. We've targeted these curtains or fences so that the fish will have to swim across them, and we'll know how many fish survive going down the river, so how many smolts go out to sea from the ones that we've tagged, so we'll look at the percentage loss, and then we'll look at the percentage losses as they go out for that first part of the journey, because it's an area that on this side of the Atlantic we don't know that much about.
Well, that first phase, once they get out to sea.
That first phase, and we've seen our friends on the Devon and the Dee have been doing this work for about 3 years, and they were expecting lots of problems in their estuary.
You mean they've already been tagged?
Some have been tagged over the last 3 years.
Okay.
I'm assuming those trackers, if a dolphin or something eats a salmon, it's probably just going to pass through, so you can get the tracker back eventually.
Well,
maybe
you won't get the tracker back,
but
will you?
I said earlier
about
the technology changing.
Yeah.
So this is the basic tag, and we're using a lot of these. We're using about £250 each.
Oh wow!
And these are the basic.
That tiny
ones.
little thing you got in your hand.
Yeah, this 250 quid for one of these.
We need to start making trackers.
But that's the basic. The new ones that are coming out as the technology develops. There's ones that are temperature and depth. So it tells you when in that coded ping that it makes, it can go, I'm number 37, and I'm now at 37 degrees.
Yeah, I'm warm.
I've been eaten
I'm in the belly.
I've been eaten by something.
Yeah.
Or I'm at 25 degrees, which is probably a shark. Dogfish or something that's slightly warmer. Or
I'm on land.
I'm starting. I'm starting to swim around in a cod-like fashion. Chances are I've been eaten by cod. But the new tech that's coming out, I think next year, which our researchers, I'm not one of the researchers, but they keep bending my head to see if we can afford any of these, is the predator tags, which go, something's just eaten me. And there's a coating on the outside of the tag that when it gets digested, changes the ping. So we know that it's a predator. It's not been caught up in a net or something like that.
Oh, wow.
We know that a predator has eaten it. We won't know what predator, but by piecing together the different bits of the jigsaw to say, well, I've gone up to 37 degrees.
Body temperatures and stuff.
Or I've gone down to this depth, or
yeah.
I'm behaving like a seal.
Mm-hmm.
If it's gone up to 37 degrees, it's behaving like a seal as it goes past the arrays.
Yeah.
Probably is a seal.
Probably is a seal.
Just out of interest, what depth do we know salmon go to? Or do we not really know that yet?
We do know that because some of the pop-up, the satellite tags where they do returning adults have shown, that these are deep sea fish, and these will dive down to several hundred meters.
Wow.
And feed, and then come back up to the surface.
I don't know why I always had it in my mind that they were kind of they would feed at the surface, high up in the water column.
It is several hundred meters.
And I suppose they will just follow the currents, won't they? So they
food that's coming on the currents as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we thought that,
We're
but
wrong.
then,
This is great.
but then we put these trackers in there.
You're supposed to be a ghillie. You're supposed to know
no,
what
no,
happened.
no.
I know, but I
You
should
should
have
have
what these experts tell me.
You should have read the reports from the D,
There you go.
because the fish came out, and these fish have got to head north. But for some reason, they came out of the river and headed southeast.
To where?
Don't know. We only had the receivers were only out so far. I think they went out about 4 kilometres. And again, in the Moray Firth, they've seen that fish where we'd think they'd be across the northern half of the Moray Firth, sort of heading north. They've hugged the coast, along the coast of Banff before heading. So this is to find out. And I think we've all got, if I was a betting man and I didn't know, I'd have agreed entirely with you. But the fish, once you put one of these in, show us where they're going. And that's what we're able to do with some of this technology, is lift the lid off and just have a look, see where they're going. It's not, everyone thinks science is some dark and mysterious art. It's not. It's as simple as getting away to look at the fish when we can't see them below the water.
But I mean, this technology has only relatively been available in the last 5 years or so. But having something that size, I know the way GPS on land has gone. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were using bricks and needed 10 power banks to supply it. Now my watch does it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's only now that the technology has been available for us to actually look at this.
So I've got another tag here, which is a Kelt or an adult tag.
Okay.
It's like the size of a AA battery.
Yeah.
And that will last a few years. It'll keep pinging.
So same. It speaks
Same
to the same
technology.
receiver, yeah.
It all works together. So hopefully, as everything gets miniaturized, the big tag will get as small as this little tag. Because 10 years ago, as you say, the smallest tags were the size of a brick. And now we're able to put these into a smolt without damaging the smolt too much.
What do you... There's a limit to how far away, that you said, about 100 kilometers. So at that point, essentially, it goes dark. You won't get any pings. You know that they've disappeared beyond that point, and they're going north, we think.
That way.
You also have... Are you also going to be using a smaller number of satellite tags to see what happens beyond that point?
We can't. I think that's... at the moment, we're taking it's steps. So we want to follow, and others are doing this. And once you start getting into that really open sea water, open ocean work, it gets really expensive.
Really?
I mean, the program we're doing in the Moray Firth, we're just trying to raise just over £1 million for the first year, which is, most of that's for the capital cost, and then it probably costs us about £200,000 or £300,000 each year to run it.
Yeah, so it's not insignisignificant amounts.
No. It's for a charity. That's a big portion of our
big amount. Is there? I know you're working with other nations as well, but are other countries doing similar work to find out exactly what's going on in the same manner, using these tags, using the pinging system, so you can get a bigger overall picture globally?
Yeah, very much so. The North Americans have been doing this for a few more years. The company that we use is a Canadian company. It's been developed over there, and we're really learning from them.
So it's been tried and tested.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're building upon their help and support and expertise to be able to do that. And they've been following from the American-Canadian border all the way up through to Greenland and Labrador. So it's bringing that experience.
And that's all on the Atlantic side?
It's all on the Atlantic, and it's building it up. And the Norwegians are doing similar work. And other people are big studies in Denmark. And it's, again, bring all that knowledge together. Get out of these ivory towers, bring it together, and make it in a form that's accessible.
And do we know what they found?
That's just what I was going to ask. This is what I was...
What were their findings?
Yeah. Well, the biggest one for, I think, some of the Canadians, sort of show the use, and to me, to pass this so what test. So why are we doing all this work? What they found when they used this kit in Canada was, as the fish went down to sea, they weren't making it, because there was a sea bass were coming up the way, striped bass were coming up into the waters and were specialising in feeding on smolts. And the conservation regulations in Canada had been geared towards protecting striped bass. And it was this law of unintended consequences. By protecting the striped bass, you'd massively increased this predator, which was then preying upon the salmon smolts as they went to sea.
So they were finding that as a significant part of the...
Yeah, and they found that the tags went into the sea bass, went into the area where the sea bass were, and then the tags started behaving like sea bass.
Amazing.
That's interesting. So I suppose, and there's absolutely nothing to back this at all, but you can start looking at different patterns. And you'll know over the past few years, cod numbers have gone down.
I thought you were about to say mackerel, because that was one of my next questions.
Well, cod numbers dropped quite significantly. And I think I'm right in saying there's been various works done to bring cod numbers back up now. And they have been coming back up.
It has improved, I believe.
In the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years.
That's the route, because when the Atlantic Salmon Trust was thinking, right, we've got a really big problem here. How do you solve it? It's don't go and reinvent the wheel. Go and see what other people have done. And the work that we're doing is modelled on the cod fishery. So in the Irish sea stocks, so that, again, putting this likely suspects framework together, what's killing the cod at different stages of their life cycle? Can we fix it? And by separating the fact from the fiction, they've been able to target measures to protect the cod stocks, which is slowly leading to a recovery. They're by no means out of the woods yet, but it's starting to turn around the problem. And that is a fish that really has all its problems out at sea.
It does, yeah,
it does.
And it is managed by humans.
So it is possible.
So it is possible. Let's not give up hope. Let's see what the problems are.
A lot of that was overfishing, though. A lot of it was identified as overfishing for cod.
Overfishing for cod, and also things like net design.
For bycatch.
Yeah. And also where the important areas.
Tell you what, Norwegian cod are bloody big.
By comparison to ours.
Comparison to ours.
I think we used to have big cod.
Yeah.
We used to have big cod, but they've gone.
I read I didn't finish reading the whole thing, but I kind of glanced over a paper that was sent to me recently about the increase in mackerel numbers on our coastal regions and the potential impact that might have on our smolts. I would imagine, being the 100-kilometre range, you might capture that now with this information, whether that has any if it's valid or not.
I think what we need to do is the mackerel. The mackerel is a really interesting theory, and it's not to mix metaphors. It might have legs,
or fins.
Full fins. But what it needs doing is it needs the homework doing on it. The gentleman who's putting it forward is highly respected, very clever guy, and he needs to get some published papers out on this, because then once it's in the scientific literature, the way science works, we can then bring it into this likely suspects framework and go, with the information we've got that's been accepted by this fisheries community, we can then go, that's accounting for X percentage of the problem. It may not be all of the problem, it may be part of the problem. And is there anything that we can do to manage that? But we need to establish and understand what the problem is, because to say that mackerel are preying on salmon smolts, it's got potential. A big mackerel is certainly big enough to eat a salmon smolt.
You know how vicious they are.
But we never really see. I don't think people have seen salmon smolts in mackerel.
But I wonder if the reason for that is that a lot of the mackerel that we catch off the coast here, they're quite close to the coast, and it's also May onwards. Most of the smolts will be gone by then.
Well, no, it's May that we'll be expecting them. It's May, June that we'll be expecting the smolts to be in our coastal area.
Are they still hanging around?
Yeah.
But they start migrating down the river from late March?
You will start, for our timetable for the work that we're doing, is we will tag the fish in rivers, in smolt traps, in April, middle of April onwards.
April, okay.
So it'll be May. But
so there definitely is a crossover between
We see that our biggest smolt one kind of May, June time.
Yeah.
May, okay.
So it's just picking it up, see where they get to. So if we see that the fish get through all the fresh water, get through the estuary, and then we're losing them between the two outer arrays,
then it could be.
Then there's something what we then have to look at what's operating in that area to find out what's killing them in that domain.
I suppose also the difficult thing with it is you're kind of doing a project like this, and you really want to find the answer, but you're probably going to find a part of
a bigger picture.
A bigger picture, yeah.
Lots of little things going on.
Absolutely, but you might find
it's probably very
compound.
unlikely to be. It's very unlikely to be one thing.
One big thing. Yeah.
But
I think we can pretty categorically say
it's not going to be
one thing.
I suppose when you maybe have, let's hypothetically say the difficulty with feeding is really impacting stocks, then you don't need stocks returning. Then you don't need much in terms of other little things to have an exponential effect on the population.
Absolutely.
So when we've talked about marine survival, if you've gone from having 300,000 or 400,000 fish returning to a river to 20 or 30,000 fish, then a bycatch of a coastal net or
as a proportion
overexploitation in a river, if there's no catch and release, then again that has a disproportionate effect. There's just not enough fish to go on. A fish is dead however it's killed, but it's just because there's not enough getting back to spawn, and that's what we need to keep an eye on.
One of the things that often comes up when I'm having these discussions about salmon with other fishermen is an argument which is very often presented with a lot of passion, is we need a hatchery on our river. That's the reason that we don't have the fish that we used to have, because there used to be a hatchery and there's always a big story around it, and my grandfather is normally involved somewhere as well. Yeah. Not my grandfather, their grandfather is normally involved somewhere as well, and we need a hatchery and that would solve all the problems. There are some cases around the country where we've seen rivers recovered as a result of implementing a hatchery that maybe even wasn't there to begin with. But talk to me about that discussion, Mark, because it can very often use up a lot of time when there are other things that we should be talking about, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to think about hatcheries is neither good or bad. It's just a tool in the toolbox for the fishery manager. And it's like any tool. Sometimes it's the right tool to use it. Sometimes it's the wrong tool. So take the Conan or Kielder on the Tyne, where they've put in a dam for other purposes. So for the Conan, it's for hydro generation. For Kielder, it's for water supply. But they've cut off the spawning grounds or flooded the spawning grounds. So if you want a fishery, it's the only tool available to you to be able to.
The fish got nowhere to spawn.
Because there's nowhere to spawn, so you need the hatchery to replicate what's been lost, and so they do that really well. But for other problems, it's not necessarily the right tool. So you mentioned here on the North Esk that you've got plenty of juveniles.
That's certainly my understanding.
Yeah. So if you've got plenty of juveniles, and that you can only get their carrying capacity.
There's a finite number that the river can support.
So the river can only hold so many. Putting more in is either.
Could it be detrimental?
Well, it could, because something's going to die. If you can only get say 20 fish in a certain area river, if you then go and put another 20 fish in, those fish have a simple choice. They either die, one of them's going to die, in which case it wasn't really effective.
And probably a waste of money.
Yeah, and you may well end up with less than 20 fish at the end. And I think that's some of the results that have been seen around.
Yeah, interesting. What do you find? So let's say if you look at areas of the river and certain places that I would imagine with good habitat are going to hold good numbers of juvenile fish, and then other places are going to be almost void of fish, largely due to the habitat. Has there been much work done trying to introduce fish to these other places, or do you find that if the habitat's not there, you introduce them to places that don't have many, and yet you still get exactly the same thing? They move to where the habitat's good, and you've still got this competition.
Yep. So if the habitat's rubbish, and you put a load of fish in there, they're either going to move off or they're going to die. And if they move off, they're either going to compete with fish where there is good habitat or not. That's not to say hatchery is good or bad. And I think people get into this that hatcheries are the answer to everything. If they were the answer to everything, we'd be swimming in fish, because everyone would be doing it.
Hatcheries are not a new thing, are they? I mean, hatcheries have been going since the turn of the century, even before that.
I first started when I was out in the Outer Hebrides. There were old spawning ponds and runs from Lord Dunmore that are about 150, 160 years old.
Well,
So it's not a new answer, is
It's
it?
not a new answer, yeah. So they've been trying it, and they come in and out of
then?
fish.
Do you think they just didn't understand? They just thought, we want more fish, let's breed more fish.
That's exactly
But they had
right.
nothing to prove really whether it was working. There was shitloads of fish back then, so...
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't even have cars, so their technology wasn't really.
But
up to
then
scratch
they
to figure
kind of
out.
worked out, because if you've got somebody on their ground, they go, that either works or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, before that, we were taking Scottish salmon and trout to the colonies, weren't we? We were
How did Falklands get their sea trout?
They took Atlantic salmon 4 times to New Zealand, and it failed every time.
Yeah.
On a bit of a whim, they took a few brown trout from Loch Leven.
Yeah, it bloody worked.
And it worked, And they did exactly the same with brown trout to Patagonia, where there's very little fly life in the freshwater environment, mainly because it's so windy. And they go up to sea, and now you've got the best saltwater,
Falklands is
the
the
best
same.
sea trout fishery in the world. Yeah.
That's it is amazing how they adapt.
We've moved fish all around the world, haven't we?
But they will do what they can do in the environment that you
Exactly.
present them.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing for them to compete with, so if you introduce them and there's no fish there already, and there's nothing for them to compete with, they're going to thrive.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like an invasive species.
Yeah.
So they'll thrive like that. But the people need to understand and recognise where hatcheries are the right tool, and also where they're the wrong tool, because it's just this flat approach saying we need a big hatchery, and if it's not working, we need a bigger one.
Mm-hmm.
Is you need to understand why you're using it. Just like, I can't fix all the problems on my car with a hammer. I can fix some, but not all.
It depends how angry you are, I find.
It does give you a warm feeling afterwards if you've managed to belt the living daylights out of the project, but it's you can't fix everything with a hammer.
I think one thing that I get asked an awful lot on the river, and this hatchery thing comes up a lot, and you're kind of a little bit stuck as a ghillie or a fishing guide, because you want to see your clients happy and you want to see them catching fish, and if they're not, they generally want to start pointing the finger at something. So you start having these debates an awful lot. And a lot of the time I find that, and this is nothing against Mark at the AST or any part of the scientific industry, but the transferring the data and the thoughts behind the scientific research, I think historically you'd probably agree, Mark, they've been quite bad at getting that message across to the anglers. And so you have a fisherman that generally, as his weeks have got worse and worse and worse, he's catching less and less fish, and he's looking for an answer. And so you naturally look to, what do we all do? We go back to what we've done for years. Oh, well, we put more fish in the river. And I think from there, I think I'll be right in saying that the scientific research going kind of against hatcheries is all about the mortality. And the mortality that you have of a wild fish, I think correct, is a return of wild fish is something like 5%.
Well, after stripping?
No, so if a wild fish,
Smolt,
a completely wild smolt,
okay.
you get about a 5% return rate.
Yep.
And studies show on a hatchery fish, you get something more like 2%.
It's about a quarter, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just because it hasn't gone through the natural process of
survival of the fittest. And so what you're doing is you're taking out a fish from the wild that would have had a 5%. You may get more eggs and more fry because you've reared them up in an artificial environment. So you may be able to release slightly more, but your percentages have gone down.
Yeah, okay.
So are you any better off than you would have been in the first place? Now, like Mark says, if habitat is a problem, then absolutely, because you're not going to get that natural survival because there's not the habitat to provide them. So then you kind of haven't got a choice. Places in Ireland where there is no spawning at all, then again you haven't got the habitat for them to do it themselves, so you have to. But then you end up in this vicious circle, and this is something I think they found and they've seen in North America quite a lot, where you start a hatchery and you see, you see small short-term benefits. You see more fish coming back, but as that percentage return rate is dropping down, the hatchery numbers have to constantly go up just to remain at the same level, because you're constantly reducing the return rate.
That's I hadn't thought of it like that, but you got to consider all these fine details and the consequences to our action, because we mustn't forget, and I think we very often do forget, and not just in in fishing, but nature will always do it best if it can.
Absolutely.
So we will never be able to do it as well as nature can do it, because there's a reason that it's evolved like that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And just to elaborate, because we have a lot of people who listen to this podcast will fish, but I know that there are a good number who also don't. In terms of the hatcheries, the way that it works is that they catch the fish at the back end of the season running up, so it's wild fish in the rivers that are then lifted out, stripped of the eggs and milk, and then that's what goes into the hatchery. Because I think there might be one or two people who are confused that think that somehow they were farmed, and then I think that was done probably in the past, wasn't it? Very much mistakenly.
And also, I think in the past, fish were moved between
from one
rivers
river.
and
all over.
And elaborate on why that is a terrible idea.
Salmon are famous for homing, and over the years that allows them to specialise and understand that and fine-tune their bodies for that environment. So you get it is survival of the fittest, and each river's slightly different. So you need slightly different characteristics to survive and thrive there the best. Because if you're not the best, something else will come in and displace you. It is survival of the fittest. So fish home to a particular river, they're at their fittest for that particular river. If you move them to another river, they won't be as fit, in which case they'll die, or they'll be fitter than what's there, in which case they'll replace what's there.
And that has happened historically, hasn't it?
Yeah, very much so. But also you've got the law of unintended consequences as well. So our friends in Norway moved fish from the Baltic over to the Atlantic, and along with their hatchery origin fish, they brought along Gyrodactylus.
Yeah, of course.
And there's been hosts of rivers that have had to be sterilised, which means everything killed, and because of this parasite.
That's scary. I mean, you see it in the fishing huts here, the information about the disease. I didn't think it was something we were necessarily going to talk about today, but I think it's important to emphasise just how important the measures are if you're fishing abroad to
biohazard control.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Control. Explain what would happen if we get it in a river here. Okay. What would happen to your river, Mark?
So if you got one parasite, these are tiny little parasites, really small. Just see them with the naked eye, but they're born pregnant. Okay, so you need one. Normally for a species, birds and bees, you need two. These things are born pregnant and can do several generations without having to mate. So you can go from having one animal, short life cycle, it can rapidly expand, and you get a population explosion of them, and you will lose, I think from memory, well over 95% of your salmon within a few years.
Is it just salmon that it attacks?
Yeah. It's different species. The Gyrodactylids affect different species, but I think it's predominantly salmon.
And what does it do to them?
It kills them.
Very quickly?
It's like death by 1,000 pinpricks.
Wow.
Not a pleasant way to
So
go.
the only way to solve it is to basically poison the river.
Yeah, sterilise the river. Get rid of every fish.
And there'll be nothing left living in there.
No fish.
Wow.
And that's kind of like your foot and mouth thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
if you find that you've got it, you need to actually control that area, wipe that area out before it gets anywhere else. The other problem you've got is, as we know, when salmon do come back to our river, but salmon also go up other rivers.
Yeah. There's always a small spillover. That's the nature's repopulation.
Exactly. And so it could spread like wildfire very, very quickly.
But also they mixed. I mean, the salmon stocks they're mixed up and down the coastline until they...
Thankfully, Gyrodactylus is a freshwater species.
Okay.
And you need to think of it like a goldfish. If you want to sterilise your kit, think of it all the ways to kill a goldfish. So if you put your goldfish into salt water, it dies. If you put your goldfish into the freezer, it dies. If you put your goldfish into the airing cupboard for a day, it dies.
Probably going to die. Yeah.
Think of all the ways you can kill a goldfish. Now, kids are really good at killing goldfish. So just ask the kids, how would you kill a goldfish? Yeah. But drying it, freezing it, putting it in salty water, or using a disinfectant like Virkon.
Yeah.
Virkon's brilliant because it kills everything. I mean, because you never know. There's other diseases out there.
But it could easily live in your felt
waders
soles
or anything.
that are stay damp from Norway to here.
If
easily.
you think about where you can, if you're going to interact with a fish with Gyrodactylus, one of the main chances is that you either catch one or you stand on a dead one.
Yeah. And
felt soles
and nets.
Yeah, brilliant way for transporting it. Neoprene waders stay damp for a long time.
It's quite unlikely that it would pass over here through fishermen. There has to be biosecurity measures, but my understanding was the only transfer of it was moving actual fish with it. But you have to be hot on this, and actually I think it's something Scotland could be a lot hotter on at the airports.
That's a good point, actually. I haven't seen anything to do with it there.
There isn't. If you go to Iceland, if you're trying to get your kit back into Iceland, you need to have a certificate to say that it's been done here.
All right.
Okay. Or they charge you at the airport.
By a specialist here?
By a vet.
Yeah, by a vet.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Even I've had Icelandic fishers come with me. I've sprayed all the kit before they've gone back. I even signed them a piece of paper to say that I'd done it from a fishing manager on the river. Wasn't good enough. They still had to do it at the airport as well.
So they'll watch you do it at the airport?
Absolutely. And usually they charge about £80 for the privilege as well.
Wow.
In New Zealand, if you turn up in New Zealand with felt-soled wading boots, not coming into the country.
Well, my walking boots, when I just went now, I scrubbed them before I left. I mean, it was a bit different, but they did take them off and they said, look, they look clean, but we're just going to... I don't know what they did. They probably dipped them and painted them with one of the disinfectants that they use, but they actually took my boots off me.
Well, when I was working in Australia diving, because I would carry my wetsuit in and out in the country, they pulled of all the things I was carrying, a spear gun, knives, all sorts of stuff on me, and the only thing that they were concerned about was my wetsuit boots and my wetsuit top. And they were, where have you been? Luckily I'd been working in Australia and they weren't that concerned about that, but if you'd been out the country, I think they would have either burnt it with fire or charged you, like you said, £80 for the privilege. The Australians are so hot on anything that...
Yeah, it's... For us with Gyrodactylus, it is a low risk of an angler bringing it in.
But it is still...
Can you imagine it? Because it's complete game over time. I mean, it is sterilise your river, start again. Actually, that's probably where a hatchery would come in, because they would take fish away, keep the genetics going, keep the genetic lines, keep those fish clear of Gyrodactylus.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah. But there is a big strategy if Gyrodactylus comes here.
Well, first of all,
but it's to stop it. 60 ghillies are just on the River Dee alone. How many ghillies are there in Scotland? That's a lot of people out of jobs instantly. Pretty much.
And the revenue of people coming in to fish those rivers. But
look at the cultural heritage. If you lose those ghillies and you lose that way of life, that whole cultural side. If you say you can't fish for 10 years, either because you spent 3 or 4 years killing your river and then another 6 years bringing it back, 10 years of not fishing a particular river. Hotels have gone and done something, they might have closed. The ghillies have gone off and done something else. Just the whole fabric goes, and that culture that's been with us for a long time, we lose it all.
It's a very good point, and it's somewhat misunderstood. I've heard people say before, especially people who maybe don't have any kind of vested interest in fishing. Well, if you're having an issue with salmon stocks in a particular river, like the South Esk, for example, that compared to the North Esk has been suffering more with the populations in. Is it working right now?
Yeah, you're good.
The populations, especially in recent years, returning from the sea, close the river. If it's a problem, don't fish it. But what a lot of people don't realise is if you don't have that vested interest in people wanting to come and fish it, who else is going to come and spend the money? Because people who walk the dogs along the river are not going to finance the river for the pleasure of funding fish that they're not even going to see. The only people who are funding that
is the fishermen.
Are the fishermen. And it's so misunderstood that. Close the river to save the fish.
I benefit from the fishermen every day from where I live. I walk the dog along the river, and it is kept really nicely, nice access. And the only reason why it's like that is because of the fishermen. There's no other reason. That would be within 2 years, because I see it because they maintain it really well. Within 2 years, it would all be overgrown. You wouldn't be walking your dog down there. I know that's one nice thing, but like I'm not putting anything into that river myself, but it just shows you the little things like that.
Absolutely, and this is a little point that I wanted to touch on. So we do quite a lot of fishing abroad, and in an awful lot of countries abroad, you have this kind of state license thing where you buy your state license and off you go. Okay, so everything's managed by the government.
Like an English rod license.
Yeah, exactly. Although a lot of places you don't even have to buy a daycare. New Zealand, for example, you can go and fish any river you like. Pretty much North America, you can go and fish. You can buy a license, off you go. Same in Argentina, same in Chile. And it is then not managed. Occasionally somebody will put a lodge on a section of river and they will manage that part of it. But generally, it is wild. And governments they cannot stretch to manage a river that closely as it does in Scotland. And I think one of the things with that's unique about Scotland is generally estates, most beats are between 2 and 4 miles long, and it's generally owned by an estate. Now these estates kind of see it, the owners, it's a right that they have the fishing, but they have to manage it. And they do, and they manage it to kind of within an inch of its life. There's one guide put on that little section. Nowhere else in the world do you get a little 3-mile section of river that has an in-house guide that looks after just that section. And so what you end up with is a river that is completely looked after. The banks are cut. And I kind of feel that, imagine if Scotland was different and it went to imagine it was public fishing for everyone.
Well, no one would maintain it.
Absolute carnage, wouldn't it?
Well, we're also, I think the other thing, we're also a small country, but New Zealand's a small country, but the terrain makes it very difficult to access a lot of the places, so that's kind of a restriction to people going there. And also, there's only 4.5 million people, we have 65
But also,
million
they don't have that access to land. You can't just walk across farmers' fields with rods.
No, but all of the rivers have access along the banks from the roads, so you can still access the rivers. The hunting
and then up the high water mark.
Exactly. But cultural heritage, as you said, Mark, is incredibly important, and there are examples recently, and there's a country, and I can't remember which one it is, that in terms of hunting as part of their cultural heritage has just been protected. It's a country in Europe. But it is very important for the footprint of who you are as a country.
I think there's 2 things there. I think there's you need to maintain that cultural heritage and that identity, and they're doing a lot of this in Sweden. Everyone thinks in Sweden everyone's really connected to the land. That was fine until the iPad and tablets came along and computers and everything else, and the kids suddenly went, you know what, this is more interesting.
And I don't have to leave the sofa.
And it's cold out there. So they've had to spend a lot of time reconnecting people with the land, with their fishing. So if you go over to Sweden, you see a lot of effort going to make sure people get out and about in the country. They really don't take it for granted, especially fishing. And it's all ages now, males and females going out fishing, really enjoying themselves. But they've had to work hard at it to maintain it, because I think they cottoned on, and you see it here. The biggest killer of fish is probably apathy. If no one gives 2 hoots, then who's going to look after the fish? No one cares.
Who's going to be concerned? Yeah.
Who's going to be concerned? And
who's going to do the research?
Yeah, so you see it in the rivers that have lost their salmon. They're desperate to get them back. You look down in England, the money that's gone into the Thames to get salmon back. The Mersey of all places. I grew up round there, and seeing what was pretty much an open sewer when I was a kid, to now seeing video footage of salmon thriving in the headwaters of the Mersey, is astonishing. I mean, but they've had to work at it, and it's because they care. And we just need to make sure that we don't take salmon for granted.
Angling bodies that have been pushing that, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the other kind of hot topics especially from the outside, it's within as well, but particularly outside the fishing community, is the idea of catch and release, which is a little bit tied to, well, if a river's really struggling, maybe you shouldn't be fishing at all. Then there's the argument also, if you're catching and releasing a fish, you are impacting that fish in some way. You are reducing the chances that it will survive to go on and spawn. What do we know about catch and release, and why is it an important tool in a country like Scotland?
I think you can kind of look at that kind of twofold, can you? If you're seeing a declining number of a species, it would make complete sense to put it back. Okay, but if we look at it from another point of view, politically, we spent the last quite a few years buying out various netting rights around the country, putting pressures on to stop commercial fishing of wild Atlantic salmon. Politically, can you be fighting those battles and trying to stop commercial fishing of them, and you're killing them in the river? You've kind of lost that argument straight away there, haven't you? So I think by voluntary catch and release, I think my experience is 90% of the fishermen are more than happy to put them back, because you're seeing last year now it's completely illegal to be in possession of a wild Atlantic salmon until the 1st of April.
Yeah, some rivers, and May on other rivers. And
I mean, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. That means government, and it's come from ICES, hasn't it, has actually turned around and say, we've noticed this decline, and actually we're making it mandatory that absolutely nobody, whether in saltwater or freshwater, can kill wild Atlantic salmon up until then.
I think that's the key. It's at the moment there's not enough fish coming back, so there's not enough fish to kill. However we kill them, whether it's in the nets or by the rods. So being able to reduce the number of fish that are killed and protect those survivors, with all the problems that are happening out at sea or in freshwater, the ones that come back are the survivors. They're the ones that have got the right equipment, the right genes to survive in our world today. Out of all the fish, they're the ones we need for the future. So whilst we haven't got enough fish to be able to take a harvest, we really do need to protect them.
I mean, I've obviously mulled over this in my mind a lot, and people have asked me the question, and it amazes me actually how many fishermen who will partake in it because they like salmon fish actually couldn't give a general member of the public a good argument as to why catch and release is good. And I think it really goes back to what we were just saying 5 minutes ago, is that without a vested interest in the river, you wouldn't end up with the investment. People wouldn't care. You can't expect people to sit back for 10, 20 years putting money into a river and not fishing it. So it's not an ideal situation, almost, catch and release, but it is the best tool that we have, I think, to keep an interest in the river, money coming in, and people who genuinely care about the long-term survival of a species bought into it, essentially. I mean that's my mindset on it.
I think when the Dee went, I think the Dee was the first river to go 100% catch and release, wasn't it? The first major river. I think you lost a certain amount of fishermen straight away.
I think some people just said no.
They were like, absolutely not. That's fine. They go to the spey. I think you can kill your second and your fourth, providing that it's a male fish. The Tweed has something similar. So I used to be on the Grimmaster. We had a voluntary catch and release. It was totally up to the client, and we still ran at a 95% release rate.
Really?
So, you lost some people straight away, but I think what we're finding now is when it first came in, we're going to introduce catch and release until we have a surplus that we can harvest. If we still had the same numbers of fish that we were catching back in the 60s and the 70s, there's no reason why we couldn't start killing fish again. If you look at the grouse industry, they harvest a surplus on a year-by-year basis, don't they? But I don't think it will go back. I think we've seen a culture change, and I think that our current fishers now, that they don't want to kill them. No? Even people that have caught their first fish.
It's a strange thing, that, isn't it? Because for me, I love to fish. We both love to fish. I grew up fishing probably a little bit before I was hunting, but at heart, I'm a hunter in every respect. So I see fishing the same. You are hunting, but you're hunting with a fishing rod.
Yeah.
But when I go out and I'm hunting with a rifle or whatever other tool it is for the purpose of killing something so that I can put it in my freezer. Whereas I'm fishing, and if I'm catch and release, it's purely for my pleasure.
This is an interesting thing.
It's a removal of the hunting instinct to it. Whereas, when I was a kid, I used to really love putting salmon and sea trout in the freezer because it tastes so damn good, and it kind of completed the satisfaction of the event for me. And we're kind of removing that aspect of it. It's almost not hunting anymore.
Which is always a bit of a dangerous way to go. I mean, if you guys do a lot of protecting the hunting industry.
Just trying to educate.
Yeah, if you've got kind of anti saying, well, why do you go and kill it? You've always got the field to table argument. And if you're killing something for food, then that's kind of foolproof, isn't it? You can't really argue with that. And by going catch and release, you've taken that away.
And this is why I said to you, a lot of fishermen, if you ask them the question, they can't actually justify catch and release. And I find that frustrating because of that. So somebody who doesn't like it, so you're only doing it for your own pleasure. You put a fish under a hell of a lot of stress. Yep. You put it back into the river. You've reduced its chances of survival. And a lot of fishermen can't then say, yeah, I know that, but for all the reasons that we just spent, speaking about for the last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
A lot of people can't have that conversation because they haven't thought about it. And I find that frustrating.
Now they can. Now they've listened to the show.
It's a difficult
It's an important
one, isn't it?
discussion to have, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to justify your actions, and I think it absolutely is wholly justifiable. But people need to realise.
And it's a means to an end. We need to reverse this decline in salmon.
Is it possible, Mark?
I think it is. I think we have to understand why it's going wrong. Once we know that, we'll be able to answer that question fully. Am I optimistic? I am. In the last 10, 12 years, we've seen periods of high abundance and low abundance in salmon numbers. The world has not fundamentally changed in that time. And it was only 8 years ago that I think Scotland had one of its highest catches, recorded rod catches. It wasn't the highest abundance of fish. But
is that fishing pressure though?
Fishing pressure, and also the nets had come off.
Okay, so you
had a nets, so there was more around. But we need to understand what the problem is, and then we need to fix it, because in this day and age we should be able to look after the salmon. They really are the canary of the sea. If there's something going wrong with salmon, it means there's something going wrong with our rivers. There's fundamentally wrong with our rivers and how we're managing them, and there's something fundamentally wrong with our stewardship of the seas. Because if we want to have a long-term future on this planet, we need to look after our rivers, because we're drinking all that water, and we need to look after the seas, because that's where a hell of a lot of our food's coming from.
It's interesting because we're talking about salmon, and obviously they're gauging them as a health of the rivers and the oceans. But you think, if we've got a problem with them, what other problems? We know of many other problems, but what problems don't we know about that's happening?
Absolutely.
What are the known unknowns?
Yeah. And that will probably link to what the salmon are feeding on, which is what
other stuff will be
all
feeding
the
on
other
that
things
too,
are feeding on as well.
They've already seen the migration of whales up to Norway in feeding grounds they've never ever seen them before. And they reckon that's due to currents, and also what they're feeding on is moving because of the ocean temperatures. So, lots of little things going on.
And if you look at decline of salmon, if you don't have to go back that far, when Spain had an awful lot of salmon, Germany, France were catching salmon, and there are still salmon there, but in much lower numbers. So you can kind of see that food going further north, and the fish having to travel further and further for it.
Do you think there's a risk with the decline and state of particularly salmon fishing across the country that new generations, which would have been enthused by it 30 years ago, I'm still enthused by it, although I'm seeing less fish than I saw when I was a kid, but people who are 12, 13 now, just as I was starting to really venture off on my own and go salmon fishing, are just not going to be doing it anymore, because the bottom line is you need the tug.
You do.
Tug's the drug.
Absolutely.
And you do need that to be invested in days and days on end, fishing little pockets of a river in the hope that you're going to connect with something silver.
I think the mentality changes. So I think and we've seen it when there were a lot of salmon about, it's just another one for the pot. Now, and you see it, the salmon is it's put on a pedestal.
You think
the prize becomes greater.
It's more of a special moment now.
It is, absolutely. And I think, and with the catch and release, I think that's why people are so happy to put them back. I'm not saying everybody is, but you're seeing more and more that they are, because, especially this year, especially with the drought in the summer, it was a long year, and you started each week with one goal, and that was to catch each fisherman one fish for the week. You weren't trying to catch 5 or 10 or have a good week and have 30, just trying to catch one. And the fishermen knew that the conditions were everything, the conditions were just so poor, we knew it was going to be difficult. But they were happy in the knowledge that they're going to have to work really, really hard just to catch that one salmon that week. And that's kind of where it's become. Now, with the youngsters, one thing that's happened with salmon fishing is the kind of demographics and the booking, how people are booking fishing has changed a lot. If you haven't got to go back that far when it was very much the landed gentry and you were invited to fish a beat for a week, and that's very much changed. You still get your weekly lets, people coming up for their week salmon fishing every year. You still get that, but that's getting fewer and fewer, and you're getting more local people sitting watching Fishpal. And if anybody doesn't know about Fishpal, Fishpal's a website that shows you river heights, river catches, fishing availability, and you can book a day's fishing through that.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant for salmon fishing, and actually absolutely brilliant to be able to make the rivers more accessible and be able to let people come in and fish them. But that has a knock-on effect as well. You're having people that are sat back watching the catches.
That's just what I was going to say.
Watching the conditions. There's not much water. There's not much getting caught.
Especially if you're local, it's easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas historically, you would have just said, "Okay, well, I'm taking these 2 days off. I'm just going to book it."
You have your week.
Or you have your week, and you fish it irrespective. Yeah. Whereas, do you think it's resulted in quite a lot of days not being taken, especially in a year like this?
It's a complete double-edged sword. Your locals. If you look at some rivers that are still, they don't publish their catches.
Okay.
At the end of the year they do, but you can't see them on a seasonal basis. And their argument is, why does everybody need to know? My clients turn up for the week, they come for the same week every year.
And they're coming to enjoy it?
Yeah, and they're coming to enjoy it. I like Fishpal. For two reasons. I like it from a fisherman's point of view, and I like it to get new people into the sport. It's a complete double-edged sword.
Because of the access it allows.
Absolutely. If there's no fish getting caught, nobody's booking fishing, so there's nobody fishing, so there's no fish getting caught, and then you get into this sort of awkward spiral. But what it does allow is, so we bring a lot of people into the sport. Which historically would have been a logistical nightmare. If they don't know anybody that currently has a week's fishing, then how do they get onto the river? They would have had to know what estate to get into. They would have had to usually borrow kit or buy kit before they even know what they're doing. Now, we can take them for a lesson, give them the kit, book them 1 or 2 days on the river, and they've just had their first kind of experience on the river. Then they can decide if they want to get into it. And what we're finding is, actually, they're not expecting to catch a fish on that first day.
Well, there's the thinking about how to cast,
getting into it, and
reading the water.
Absolutely. Are you seeing yourself some youngsters coming through? Quite a few youngsters.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't say. So our kind of target market, you have to understand with salmon fishing, you're spending a minimum of £50 a day, aren't you?
Yeah.
For a day's fishing. So I would say we get a lot of people between 25 and 40.
Doing it for the first time?
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
And then we get, probably change that 25 to 35. Then you have the bracket when you've got kids and families, and you physically don't have the time, and you tend to lose quite a lot of people then. And then the next kind of market that comes to us are the guys that are just maybe not retired, but just kind of calming down a little bit at work, got a little bit of money behind them, looking for a hobby. They already play golf.
Bit that hobby, get a real hobby.
Exactly. And they're looking for something as well. And the great thing with Fishbowl is it's made this accessible for them. Once they've committed to buy some kits and some waders, they can look at they can go. Whereas historically, you can never do that.
Well, I'm pleased. I'm pleased that is what you're seeing. That it's you haven't seen a decline in people wanting to fish the river.
You have to work at it. You really do. And I think this. I was mentioning Sweden earlier.
Yeah.
Where they've gone. We've just got. It's an ageing population. It's male. They're all on the wrong side of north of 60, 70. And that's not a good demographic for getting youngsters coming through. You need a good balance of all the ages coming through the sport.
I mean, is there a countrywide, is there anything that people can get behind countrywide to encourage youngsters in? I mean, it's very good doing it river by river, but it's really a countrywide issue that we can hear. Is there anything in place in Scotland right now?
I think the fishery boards and trusts are doing some work on that, and you've got different people feeding into it.
We do lots of things with scout groups.
Okay.
The River Board does, I can't remember how many, but quite a lot of school groups, generally trout fishing, just to get them outdoors and get them into it.
It's a good place to start.
Absolutely,
trout fishing.
I love trout.
I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely great. And you're never looking. You're not going to get a salmon fisherman out of a trout straight away, but you've got to set that seed early. Lads and Dads Days, the few beats have done Lads at Park, I think did a Lads and Dads Day this year, just opened up the whole beat for Lads and Dads, which was great. Yeah, absolutely. But I think Mark's right. Al and I may see a slightly younger demographic with the nature of our kind of
the way that you
presence and the way that we run our business. I'd say the demographic on Fishbowl is probably slightly older than that, and you do have to keep working at it on a national level.
It's hard because even in the hunting and shooting world, it is a concern. It's a concern for me. I don't. If I even think at my age and the people I went to school with, I think I can think of one person. One person who shoots, and maybe another two people who fish. That's it. And my whole year group of school now. That's it.
And do you think that's something that has changed, or do you think it's that kind of? I think with the fishing, we say we're always missing that younger generation, but I kind of feel like we've probably always been missing that younger generation. And you have this kind of historically you went with your parents on your family trip to the river. You then have that middle section of building a family and work life, and then you kind of come back to it. So I think every generation has said we're missing the younger generation of people.
Maybe I'm not sure.
Different. I always felt it was normal to go out.
I knew I was not normal.
And you went yourself.
And I just went myself, and I was fishing all the time. And I don't think I fished with anybody from school. I fished with my cousin. He was my big fishing buddy who went to New Zealand because there were more trout there. But that was it. But
growing up in an area of coarse fish, it was you went out fishing with your mates from school. You went out fishing. You going out on a camp for scouts or cubs. At least one of those days would be out fishing. And it was the norm, and it was the bloke down the road that gave you a lift to take you fishing. Well, people don't let you do that to your kids anymore. Bloke down the road.
It's sad.
It's sad, but so there's that what used to happen has stopped, and then it needs to be a bit more organised to replace it.
Well, yeah, it is something which I think everybody listening, especially if you fish, maybe need to think about. Try and take out somebody new for the season.
Yeah,
well, the season's just finishing now, but next year, take out somebody new for the season who you think might be interested, because it's even if it's just for the fascination of buying rods, reels, and tying flies, keeps the industry going. Something I missed to bring up before when we were having the very serious debate about our missing fish was particularly our West Coast and salmon farms. It's been in the media a lot in the last few months, so it would be very remiss of me not to bring it up. Mark, what do you see as the big issue over salmon farms on the West Coast, and how that's connected to our wild stocks? There's a lot of politics there, I know, but see if we can kind of mull our way around it.
Yeah, the big issue is sea lice. For those that don't know, sea lice is it's a naturally occurring parasite. It's like a flea or a tick. It's not like a flea or a tick, but it lives on the skin of the fish, and you get them on wild fish. Have done always have had sea lice on them. The problems occur is when sea lice go from wild fish onto farm fish, and because of the number of salmon in a fish cage on a fish farm are huge. You know, you can have
densities.
2,000 tons of fish in an area. Those sea lice can multiply rapidly, and what's gone from being background level, naturally occurring background level, you can get these huge blooms of sea lice, which then go and reinfect wild fish. Now, the farmers can treat to varying degrees of success on their fish farms, but what we can't do is treat the wild fish. So the problems occur is when the young fish, the smolts, go to sea, whether the salmon or sea trout, they pick up the lice that are free swimming in the coastal waters, get infected. Sea trout tend to come back after they've had an infection of them, come back to fresh water and either die or lose a summer's growth. And growth is everything, because you need to survive over the winters. Salmon, we're not sure what happens. They don't show that same behaviour. We think they probably die at sea. What we've seen this year on some of the rivers on the islands is fish with the low water conditions, adult salmon coming back and really suffering with lice burdens in the hundreds, which is just horrendous. And they've seen similar numbers elsewhere, and it's a great cause for concern. And
this year, I think, has been particularly bad because of the hot weather for lice as well.
The sea's not been particularly warm. The rivers have been particularly warm, and fish haven't been able to get into the rivers.
So they've been sat out.
Yeah,
so they're stuck in the salt water where they can't get rid of them.
But you know what? If we need to look at regulation of aquaculture. Actually, we probably need the consumers when they're looking at salmon in the supermarket to think about, where did that fish come from? How was it looked after?
And how was it impacting its environment?
Yeah, so in the same way that we've got standards for lamb and the lamb and beef industries, let's have those standards there for the aquaculture industry, because I think the consumer should be able to ask for that. And the Atlantic Salmon Trust, we think the best way to deal with this is separate the activities.
Yeah,
I agree. There is a demand for people to eat salmon as a healthy source of protein.
It's evident.
Yeah, they want that. Otherwise, they wouldn't grow it if they couldn't sell it.
Yeah.
So there's a demand out there. So and it's an employer on the West Coast where it's a tough economic climate out there. So all of that's understood. But actually, farming in cages, open cages to the sea, is really an outmoded, dated, prehistoric way of farming.
It's insane.
Yeah.
When you start to understand the consequences of doing it that way.
Absolutely.
But not just for the wild fish. I mean,
for the farming.
For the farming. In terms of treating it and using reduced in terms of cost for chemicals for treating, you're continually open to the environment for disease and everything else.
The best way to farm, is in a closed containment system.
Which they do in some places.
Some parts of the world they do it. In Iceland they do it. I saw some videos of footage in Iceland where they were able to do. They have farm closed containment systems in Scotland, in Ormsby, for years and years and years.
I didn't know that.
And they do it as broodstock, or historically did it as broodstock. And so the technology's there. So there just needs to be the will and to get up and go to do it.
It's the capital cost of setting it up. Is that what the barrier is for these companies doing it, or is it? I mean, if they're working within the regulations.
Some of them have the money to do it. Some of them.
I think they have the money. I think I have sort of chap was fishing with me a few weeks ago that actually makes some of the equipment for the salmon farms, and he was saying demand is growing so quickly that they're going at 110 mile an hour just to keep up with demand. But actually. And he's got very much kind of love-hate relationship with the business because that's his livelihood. And likewise, he's a fisherman as well. It will come. I think it will come. But I think the pressures need to be kept on to make sure it comes quickly. I think
there's two things. You've got regulation here.
But regulation would fix it overnight.
Well, actually, I think there's a much more powerful tool than a regulator, because the regulators They can't be everywhere at all times. And the most powerful thing out there are consumers and where they buy. So if the supermarkets say, we need this to be by close containment, we think that way you can lower your impact on the environment, you can have more control over the product you're giving us. That way the farmers will go, the farmers will switch.
Well, they'll want that little logo, won't they? Like rod caught tuna. They'll want that.
Well, look
close
at the
containment
success
salmon
story of tuna.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't take many years when all that hoo-ha was going in. Now everybody looks for the dolphin-friendly sign.
Yeah. And the little rod symbol.
And eggs, where you had battery cage eggs, which is, there's.
Like used to be 5 at 4. I used to work on a chicken farm, and when I first started, this is when I was very young, I think there used to be 3 in a cage, and then the following year, more regulation. Now it was 2 in a cage, and then after that it was...
But people didn't want it as well.
It was the consumer and the supermarkets that said, we want these welfare standards. We want to go from a battery cage to a free-range egg, which with a higher capital cost, a higher running cost. But we'll pay it. We understand that. That's what we want as consumers. And I think there needs to be a similar debate and looking at the pros and cons to bring that on for the agriculture industry. Now, it's not straightforward, made it out to be quite simplistic, but we need to encourage them either through regulation or through consumers asking, how's that fish been grown? To what standards has that fish been grown? And what impacts has that had on the surrounding wildlife? And if we can get that, the industry, they're in a fairly young industry. They're only 40, 50 years old in Scotland. They will adapt. They can be quite dynamic when they want to be, and they will move over to close containment very, very quickly if the market demands it.
If it wasn't a fish and it was another animal that wasn't in the water on land, it would have been changed by now because of when you actually get your head around the cages. Well, we've seen them. I've seen them firsthand, and you look at actually how many there are in there. It's quite horrific, actually, when you, as a consumer, you actually think about what your food is, because you wouldn't.
Well, that's almost a different discussion. That's almost like the animal welfare of the fish.
But my point being is that as a consumer, people buying fish, you need to think more about it, because most people think nowadays, especially when you're buying some beef and it's probably horse and stuff like that from the shops, most people are thinking a little bit more about what's going into their food, but I don't think they care quite as much about fish because it's cold and wet. Yep. So people just need to care a little bit more. And
if anybody wants to know, if they look online at the moment and just search sort of salmon farming, or I think Corin Smith's website is very good, look at some of the pictures. And that will be enough to put you off eating wild salmon, farmed salmon, straight away.
I think that there is the extreme end, and where you do see the horrific images. And I think there is parts of the farming salmon industry that are probably doing some pretty good stuff, especially with the closed containment, where you go, actually, this is a resource that we can use and feed the world with, but it's just getting it.
It's just getting it
right. And the argument, especially for employment on the West Coast, you can't. It can't be the argument of, well, we need the job, so anything goes kind of thing. But
it can't be the reverse either.
You still have to take into account that it is important for people to have these jobs, and in some cases, if it wasn't there would be no population of people in certain areas.
And there would be no population of wild salmon. The biggest thing that salmon farming did was took the pressure off the wild Atlantic salmon.
Catching
the world the world still demands to eat salmon, don't they? And so it has to be there.
When you read the headline grabbing stuff on social, I think one of the misperceptions is that there is a drive to ban salmon farming. I think that's it's not really the case, and I don't think that's what most people are driving for, though that's actually what it kind of appears when you look at Facebook and social media. It is just doing it better, doing a better job at farming, taking into account the environment. I mean, and just to emphasize the impacts that some of the salmon farms have had on the West Coast, and why I brought up the question in the first place. The one that we know quite well because we made a film on it is Loch Marie, which it's pretty much undeniable that that fish farm being in place in Loch Ewe is a major factor in the decline of what was one of the world's biggest and best sea trout fisheries. And there are plenty of other examples like that up and down the West Coast. So it has had a massively detrimental impact on that local area. Yes, there's employment from the fish farm there, but in that particular instance, I think there's been a vast amount of employment lost. I couldn't believe it when I was speaking to one of he's basically the last ghillie left there. There's like 20, 30 people employed. So not even a very big system.
Part of the hotel and everything.
The hotel is.
And
I
if
was
you
sad.
look at the money incoming, so the farming might employ people on the farm. But if you imagine what it used to be when you had 10 fishermen coming every day with all the guides and all the hotels and food suppliers and the knock-on effect.
I think with Loch Marie, particularly because it's easy to look at that because we did quite a lot of work there, the fishing angling industry made the salmon part look like nothing compared to, because there were so many more people.
I think one of the key areas we've got to get to is being able to have faith in the industry. And we've got the regulation, and it can be quite difficult to get all of the information and really understand what's truly happening there. But in the same, there was an initiative a good few years ago in the Marine Stewardship Council on what was sustainable fish. So we were talking about cod earlier. Are your cod sustainable? And if you see all the chefs, any cookery program, please see the list of MSC sustainable fish that are there, and it's on after every program. And people know that if they want environmentally friendly fish, look for the MSC logo on there. I think where we need to get to is where we can have an Aquaculture Stewardship Council, so that we can all have faith, and it's all done in the open and transparent way, that those fish were produced well and sustainably, and there's the evidence to back it up. And to have that with the an ASC label would just be a massive step forward for us all, being able to say, that's the way ahead. We can have faith in that product. And again, it's part of consumers understanding about it, aquaculture industry understanding about it, and wild fishery interests like ourselves understanding it and having rational discussions about this.
I think unlike we were using the battery chicken example and how that's changed, unlike that, what needs to be done on the aquaculture side needs to happen faster, because the consequences are far greater. That was an animal welfare issue that was artificial, whereas the impacts of what's happening in terms of the aquaculture is happening to wild fish stocks and a lot of stuff that we can't control, on top of all the issues that we spent the previous hour talking about.
On a fish farm, there is not a farm gate, because it's open pen fishing. So whatever's in the environment comes into your farm. Whatever's in your farm goes back out into the environment, because it's open pen fishing. Hence why we need close containment, because then you can have the equivalent of a farm gate. You can have it separated, and
it's a different environment.
It's a different controlled environment, and they don't get the problems from the wild fish bringing in any contagions, any parasites, anything like that, and vice versa.
The thing is, we're talking about it, but it's as if they need to do it soon. But the technology, but like you said, it's already there. They just need to do it.
They need the driver.
They need the carrot.
Yeah.
The carrot needs to be there.
The driver are, you need to engage not the fish farmers, because I from all the fish farmers I know, one or two exceptions, but they mean really well, and they care passionately about their fish, and they try and do their best job. It's the bean counters.
Yeah,
and it's those people that we need to get on side to
because they're the guys who are signing the checks for the capital investment.
And I think you'll get such a domino effect. I think once one commits to it on a large enough scale, the problem is it has to be on a large enough scale to compete with everybody else that's doing open cages, because your capital is, you're going to have to put so much money into to the capital value of it to begin with, and then your running costs.
The running costs should be lower.
They should be lower. There's going to be a little bit of time until they just get it right.
Back, yeah.
But once one of them goes that way, I think everybody will go that way.
Like free-range eggs, you pay a slight premium.
Yeah.
But everyone's willing to do it. There's some good analogies there.
Most people wouldn't even notice if it increased a little bit.
No.
If it was a closed containment and increased by a little bit, most people wouldn't even know, because most people couldn't even tell you what the going price for salmon
a kilo of salmon is.
Yeah.
No, most people couldn't.
So it wouldn't upset them because they don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
A lot of issues there, and a lot of things that we all need to be concerned about and try and understand. I think that that's the care. We need to care enough to try and understand and then act. I mean, I make a point of never buying salmon to eat. I never order it in a restaurant. I always normally ask the cheeky question, "Where's your salmon from?" And at the very least, I expect them to know which fish farm it's come from, and they never can. I don't think I've ever asked the question and they've been able to tell me where it is.
And you occasionally see the sign "wild Atlantic salmon."
Oh, really?
Really? Sure?
How often do you see that though?
Not very often
Not anymore, but
anymore.
you used to see it.
2 years
a lot,
ago, you used to see
which
it.
of course you can't sell wild Atlantic salmon. But yeah, you used to see that. But I think people have obviously been picked up on it.
So apparently now on your packaged salmon. I'm not sure if it's every company, but most companies that do it, you can actually see the name of the fish farm that's come from.
You can now.
It's getting that way.
But
I've seen it on a
few. The
few.
thing is, if more people start doing things like that, questioning, restaurants questioning, where's this come from?
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, it's okay. I don't want it because
you can't tell me.
You can't tell me. Then they'll start clicking on that. There's evidently a problem here, and people need more information about where their food's
So next time you're in the supermarket, ask them at the counter if they know exactly where their salmon has come from.
I would like to think the supermarket would know. I'd like to think they
was
would.
it sustainably sourced?
Was it sustainable? Is there a list that exists of fish farms that you'd be happy to say it's fine to eat fish from?
I think when we get the Aquatic Aquaculture Stewardship Council standards up and running, and we get farms signing up to that,
is that
then
to
me
soon?
That's where someone's come in and said.
Because I'd love that. I'd love me to be able to look on a list and say, okay, these are the dozen farms, and me to be able to go into the shop and happily feel good about it.
They already have that, but there's issues with the RSPCA assured.
Well, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that came out about the RSPCA
exactly.
assured
Well,
stuff. It was public in the newspaper.
No, it's public. But I don't think I would buy from anyone because I don't think they could.
Well, this is the thing. I don't have faith. I currently don't have faith in the system to know that yes, that fish farm is doing a good job. I feel good about giving you my money to eat that salmon.
But that's again where, without trying to labour a point, where the Marine Stewardship Council have been brilliant, because we don't need to know the ins and outs of their labelling. We have over the years got faith in this system.
Yeah, we do.
And people test the system, and if something's not found to be sustainable, it's removed. They've got no qualms about removing it if the standards aren't being met. So it means that the consumer can have faith in the system, which is surely lacking at the moment. And we need to be able to get there.
To just as a kind of closing point, something that I wanted to bring up and just to change the subject slightly. We haven't really seen any pink salmon this year. But last year we saw lots. What do you think, Mark? What's happening? What's happening there? What are we going to see? What's your prediction for next year? Because I know next year is kind of going to be the big teller as to.
It is. You seem to be when we've seen these were introduced into the White Sea in Russia in the Soviet area, and they brought in odd year populations and even year populations, and although they're the same species, they don't really mix that much.
That I didn't know. That's news to me.
It's a fixed lifestyle that the fish. So they hatch, spend a little bit of time in fresh water, not much. They go to sea as really their smolts are what we'd call fry.
Yeah.
And they go off to sea and they come back. And people in certain parts of the world can set their calendars by when the fish come back. It's not like it's summer, fish will come back. It's the 13th of July. There they are. We have the odd year population dominant here, and that's what we had last year. We will, if they're going to come back, we'll see them next year as if it's the odd year population. The even year populations are present in Norway and have been colonising as well separately, and they're perhaps a cycle or two, generation or two behind the odd year population. But
do you think they're here to stay?
I don't know. If you read the books, then they shouldn't have come here. But there's been here. You had
in
first
very small
record since the
numbers.
1960s.
Yeah.
First one was seen on the D in the 1960s, which was an even year. But there's been strays, and then last year there was a phenomenal.
It was crazy, yeah.
And it was right across the Atlantic. So something happened to promote them, and they're really good at colonising the fish, colonising areas. And if you read the textbooks, they shouldn't be here. It's not the right temperature regime for them, and so they won't spawn. Well,
but they did spawn.
But they did spawn.
They did.
And then the eggs shouldn't develop.
And they did.
Well, they did develop. And then they shouldn't hatch. Well, they did hatch, and they shouldn't smolt. Well, they did. And so they,
Nature's
the
amazing.
people who are advising on this have obviously not watched Jurassic Park, where life will get away. And what pink salmon are famed for is colonising new areas. They're one of the world's greatest colonisers. So,
so they in the long
are
term,
the guarantees
they probably will be here then. In the long,
we
term.
don't know.
We don't know.
There's
New sport for you, Will?
Well, it's interesting. I was. You look at it from 2 points of view, don't you? You look at it from you want to come to Scotland to catch Atlantic salmon. You don't want to catch pink salmon. I was in Russia last year, and there was a hell of a lot of them. And the slightly awkward thing is they die after spawning straight away. So then you've got the riverbanks, which the wilderness of Russia's kind of geared up for because it's bears to eat them and all sorts.
Yeah.
In Aberdeenshire, your dog's eating them. Basically,
It's
and they are
horrible.
rotting
Horrible.
on the banks. You
It's
see them in British Columbia and Alaska and things.
Yeah.
But again, it's a big wild area with bears and things, and we're just not geared up for it.
Maybe a few bears on your river system will.
That's what you're missing.
Absolutely, yeah. And you it sort of took away from it a little bit. You're wading through dead fish to get to the river. And this was in Russia, to get to where the pool is, So there's a hell of a lot of them.
I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah.
On the other hand, it's another species to catch. They shouldn't affect the Atlantic salmon.
There's a bit of an interaction. They're the Jack Russell of the fisheries world because they're small, like a Jack Russell.
They only go
And
to
they have
5-6 pounds max.
Yeah, they have an attitude like a Jack Russell. Normally, when you get salmon in the net, it's like, okay, that's me. I'm over and done with
Please
it. Pink salmon is like, come on then. I know you're 6 foot tall, but I'm going to have you.
I've never caught one.
And they are they're quite. They are like the Jack Russell, but they do displace. One of the facts that we do know about them is they do displace autumn running Atlantics. They just see them off like a Jack Russell with a Labrador.
In terms of sitting in the pools.
Yeah, and so that's a pain. And last year, when I asked the gillies what they wanted, they thought, it's another fish to catch. And then they turned up, and it was, help us get rid of them, please. We don't want them here. Because whilst they're lovely fish to eat when they're in this fresh off the sea, very, very quickly they turn into these really currant, manky fish
that you don't want to eat.
that has just got attitude and is full of teeth.
And you foul hook them in the hump.
Oh, you
As
do?
you fly swinging around, you foul hook them in the hump all the time. And we actually found that we felt like it was quite high water when we were out there, and where we thought we should have been finding Atlantics on the crease of the currents and things like that, they weren't, because that's where all the pinks were. And so you're having to try and catch them.
Did you pick up quite a few last year?
Yeah. Not in Scotland. This is in Russia. But yeah, they end up becoming a little bit of another one of them rotten, dying fish that kind of wants to be left alone.
Trying to work out what do we know about them, and are they going to be part of the fixtures and fittings? If they are, how are we going to deal with them? What are going to be the impacts? Because like any of these invasive species, it's best to catch it in the bud. The person who first saw giant hogweed when it started colonising riverbanks should have gone, we need to nail that now. Or the first squirrels that got out, or the first mink that got out.
Easy at the beginning.
Yeah, really easy at the beginning. So let's see if it can be dealt with now, because if it's going to have a detrimental impact, and when you think about all the invasive species, when they come to a country, always cause a problem. I can't think of anything that has been beneficial yet that's come in as an invasive species. I think I best leave that as an open challenge.
I was busy trying to
because I can see people thinking here, and I can't think. I've still not been able to think of any.
Talking of invasive species, crayfish. How much of an issue are they, and are we ever going to get rid of them? American signal crayfish, obviously.
Best thing is, don't have them. Don't have surveillance to make sure they're not coming into your waters.
You want regular monitoring to try and find
regular
out.
monitoring. Make sure you've not got them, because if you get them, if you see the first signs of them, get in there hard and try and deal with them. But it is an absolute nightmare.
And what's the direct consequences of having them in your river? If you don't have native crayfish, which a lot of
burrowing into riverbanks and predation on fry.
So again, could hammer the salmon.
Yeah.
Back to salmon again. Yeah, but apparently they taste quite good.
I don't know. I've eaten big.
I think that's what they were introduced for, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Originally for food.
I once caught one on the fly.
A crayfish.
Yeah.
On a bloodworm, and it had slipped onto it. It wouldn't let go, just like your Jack Russells. They're like
So just holding with its claws.
just holding on with his claws, and then flicked him off on the bank. And instead of running back into the water, you know how a crab kind of comes at you with the claws, came at me with his claws. I mean, it was amazing.
Where was that?
This was on a trout fishery in England.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've not seen them myself, but I know they've got them down in Cumbria, don't they?
they're big.
Mm.
You know, they're sort of.
You're within 10 miles of them here.
I've not seen them though.
Yeah, no, they are. I believe they're in some of the waters around here,
Yeah.
and it's a problem. And
But are you allowed to take them out?
I
does
can't
it
remember
under
what the law
license
is on
still?
that now.
different laws, different parts of the
Yeah.
UK. I think you can get. I know when I was working on a river, we used to put out surveillance traps for them. But like any trap, you got to check it every day. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a nightmare.
But there was a guy down south somewhere, and he thought he was doing a great deed by taking out all these American signal crayfish, and it turned out that he just murdered a whole bunch of native crayfish instead.
I have been seeing online more and more people
Scott Ree was recently.
eating them. So there must be some rivers down south that you can they obviously know there's just.
I think they're probably farmed as well, aren't they?
I'm
The
not sure.
crayfish, not the freshwater ones, but.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. I used to dive for them in Australia. Not the freshwater one, the saltwater ones, and they are in huge numbers. I also worked on one of the crayfishing boats there, and the crayfish, they're in very large numbers, but they manage their fisheries really well. But what amazed me is how big these damn things are, and how powerful they are. I mean, the sea crayfish they've got there are
More like lobsters.
probably bigger than any lobster I've ever seen in this country.
Really?
Way bigger. They just don't have the big pincers. That's all. And they can swim fast. They're incredible little things. Well, little big things.
We started talking about salmon, now we're talking about crayfish. Mark, how can people find out more about the Missing Salmon Project or get involved in some way?
We have come and have a look at the Atlantic Salmon Trust website or Facebook page. It's got links into the Missing Salmon Project. We're going to be keeping up to date. One of the things that we really want to do is do our work transparently. So we're inviting people to come and see the work. We will be putting as much of it, not in dry, dusty scientific tones.
Please, no, please.
No,
Entertaining.
I cannot.
Pretty
I can't
pictures.
abide those. I can't understand them either. The aim is to get the video footage, get stuff on our website, our Facebook page, and really, as we're going along, so people can see how the work's been, how the information's been collected, what it means. Talk to people, because come see. We will be starting the work in the field next spring when the smolts go to sea. So we're starting to gear up shortly, and that'll run through the late spring. We'll start to take out all these receivers in July. Start to do all the homework over and the writing up over the summer and early autumn months, and then we intend to run a couple of conferences, one in London, one in Edinburgh, and for bringing together the research that we've undertaken, but do it in a non-technical format. So it's just plain speaking, this is what we found. Because if we want to convince people, we need the scientific evidence, but we need to be able to communicate it. And I think perhaps that's where we touched on it earlier, but where we went wrong where scientific community went wrong with the hatchery debate, was because they couldn't communicate properly. Well, we've got some difficult issues to face, and we want to be able to talk openly about that with people. So it'll be on our website. We're also open to come and talk to people face-to-face wherever they are. So if there's a group wanting someone to come along and talk about the work, we're quite happy to come and do that. But AtlanticSalmonTrust.org is the best place to start.
Well, yeah, I hope that within my lifetime I can see a big turnaround. You know,
that's what we're
I hope so.
That's why we're doing it. We're not there just to do more research. We're doing this for a reason, and our volunteers and our trustees are extremely focused on turning it around. Nothing else matters to them. They're a good bunch of people.
Well, I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see what the outcomes are, and we might even go and do a podcast from in the field when you're starting to put the trackers.
That would be good.
Pretty cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
And Will, how can people find out about what you're up to if they want to come and fish with you guys through your fishing school? And
so
details with your brother who's not here today.
No, you can just go to twinpeaksflyfishing.com. Basically, if anybody fishes a little bit and wants to sort of get in, perhaps you've done trout and you want to get into the world of salmon, or perhaps
you
do
can't
salmon.
cast for shit like me with a double-handed rod.
Or you want to just learn how to spade cast, or you want to just have a go. Just we're kind of that stepping stone to try and get you into the sport. So get in touch, twinpeaksflyfishing.com on Instagram, Facebook, website. Yeah,
all the usual places.
All the usual places. Yeah. Yeah, we really, really, really welcome it, whether you're a big group, father and son, or just one person that fancies giving it a go.
And Will's a fellow filmmaker, so you can go and check out his films. I'm sure they're probably on your website.
They're on the website, yeah.
Excellent. Well, gents, thank you very much for taking time to come and see us today. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I think we will have enlightened a lot of people with this podcast.
So. Yeah.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this show. If you'd like to contact us, it is podcast@paceproductionsuk.com. That is the best way to contact us. But we're also on all of the social medias. Facebook, it's Podcast Into the Wilderness. Instagram, which is probably the thing that we put the most on, and we're a lot more active on it, is just pace_brothers. And if you don't have Instagram, I encourage you to go and get it, because it is one of the better of the social media platforms.
And if you message us on Twitter and we don't reply, don't think we're ignoring you. It's just that we don't really use it.
Yeah, we just check it once every 6 months or a year. To be honest, I think we probably will delete Twitter at some point, because it's just pointless. Like, we don't use it. And if you'd like to check out any of our stuff, then it is www.thepacebrothers.com. You can download the show on many, many, many platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Podcast Addict, you name it, we're on it. So.
And if you want to have a look at the videos that we've made, I've just finished putting up a whole bunch on our Vimeo channel, our Pace Productions UK Vimeo channel. Hopefully, if you're a regular listener, you will know that what we do most of the time is make films. So you can go and check out, I think, all of the major films that we've made now on the beautiful HD on Vimeo, which is much better than you.
It is better. And if you want to check out our films or anything, you can use the Pace Brothers channel and it'll show you some of them, or go on I think on the bottom there's a link to our production company's website, which is Pace Productions UK.
I thought you'd forgotten what it was called.
I genuinely did. I forgot what the website address was there for a second. But we'll join you in 2 weeks' time. I'm not 100% sure who's going to be on, because we're in Ireland, so we don't know if we'll have one of those guests on, or we'll have someone else.
But it'll be good, whatever it is.
Whatever it is, it'll be good. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.